It's an honor and an honest joy for me to introduce this year's McClure Lecturer, Reverend Dr. Steve Bevans, Roman Catholic priest, member of the Society for the Divine Word, and the Louis J. Luzbetek, SVD professor, now emeritus, of Culture and Mission at Catholic Theological Union in Chicago. Dr. Bevans is a leading missiologist. He has written a number of books, some of which are the field-defining books, Models of Contextual Theology, and Constance in Context, Theology of Mission for Today. So I was thinking about these remarks. I thought, there are going to be a number of folks present who know the name Steve Bevans. They won't have met him, but they'll say, you know, I think of contextual when I think of Steve Bevans. And as I thought about this, I began to realize, yes, we understand contextual theology largely because the work of Dr. Steve Bevans. He holds degrees from the Pontifical Gregorian University in Rome and the University of Notre Dame, from which he holds a PhD. He served as a missionary for a number of years in the Philippines, and since 1986 as a member of the faculty at Catholic Theological Union in Chicago. But it's not only because Dr. Bevans is an eminent missiologist and scholar that I take pleasure in introducing him, but because he's a friend and he's a wonderful human being. I met Steve first in Montreal in 1997 at a meeting, if I remember rightly, on globalization and mission. Now, Steve had heard that I'd just moved literally from the other side of the earth to Chicago. And so he contacted me at this meeting and said, could we take you to dinner, just so that I would feel welcome? And over the years that followed, I began to understand Steve as a person of hospitality, both personal hospitality and theological hospitality. I've stayed in touch over these years, and for a number of years recently, we met a couple of mornings each week over breakfast, thanks to Steve's hospitality, and shared morning prayer. And I began to understand a kind of theological hospitality in Steve because, Roman Catholic priest, I found that he would regularly hang out with evangelicals and Pentecostals, even Presbyterians, maybe not so often, that's not true, and even World Council of Churches. He now sits on the WCC's Commission on World Mission and Evangelism. Thank you, Steve, for the model that you've given me and given many of us of theological hospitality. And thank you so much for accepting our invitation to give this year's McClure Lectures. Please join me in welcoming Dr. Steve Bevans.
Well, thank you so much, David, for a lovely, lovely introduction. I deeply appreciate that. And I want to say, first of all, how honored I am to be here, to stand at this podium, to honor a missionary of 50 years from this very seminary. This is a real honor. I think it's wonderful that I, as a Roman Catholic, and you're going to hear a lot of Roman Catholic stuff in this lecture, that I'm able to speak here and honor this certainly great man. My topic for this first lecture this evening is one that perhaps needs a little background or a little context. From almost the first day after being elected Pope, Pope Francis talked about mercy. Mercy and the tenderness of God seemed to be words that were always on his lips. And in a time of corruption in our church, both with the Vatican Bank and the sexual abuse crisis and all that stuff, Francis was constantly coming back to, we have to be people of mercy because our God is a God of mercy. And so about a year into his pontificate, he declared that 2015 to 2016, kind of November to November, would be a year of mercy. And so in the Catholic Church, we've been reflecting on mercy. We've been rejoicing in this great God of mercy and tenderness and trying to conform our church to that tender and merciful God. And so this is the origin of this particular lecture. And being a missiologist, I naturally wanted to connect this to the mission of the church. And so I've entitled this lecture, A God of Mercy, a People of Mercy, and then how the Year of Mercy connects with the mission of the church. I want to begin this lecture with a famous poem. It's a poem that you probably have all read, probably sometime in your high school years. It comes from one of the last scenes of Shakespeare's The Merchant of Venice. And I think it really captures what a theology of mercy and a mission of mercy is about. The quality of mercy is not strained. It droppeth as gentle rain from heaven upon the place beneath. It is twice blessed. It blesses him that gives and him that takes. 'Tis mightiest in the mighty. It becomes the throned monarch better than his crown. His scepter shows the force of temporal power, the attribute to awe and majesty, wherein doth sit the dread and fear of kings. But mercy is above this sceptered sway. It is enthroned in the heart of kings. It is an attribute to God himself, and earthly power doth then show likest God's when mercy seasons justice. Therefore consider this, that in the course of justice none of us should see salvation. We do pray for mercy. And that same prayer should teach us all to render the deeds of mercy. So that famous speech of Portia, which no doubt has been quoted many times in this year of mercy that we Catholics are celebrating, really startled me when I reread it, when I was preparing these reflections. I said, I know there's a Shakespeare poem about mercy someplace. I read it in 9th grade. And I read it, and I was absolutely startled because I found here the outline for what I want to share about mercy and mission. Mercy is an attribute of God as such. And people are most like God when they season justice with mercy, when they render deeds of mercy. And so my reflection is going to be in two parts. The first part is to reflect on the triune God, God who is a communion in mission, who is a God of mercy. And then in the second part, I want to talk about how we as church are called to participate in God's life through our baptism, and so are called to be a people of mercy. Or as I said this morning in my sermon in chapel, paraphrasing Pope Francis, that we are called to be a community of missionary, mercy-bearing disciples. So let's look first of all at God of mercy. God of mercy, who is in God's self a communion in mission. Shakespeare speaks of mercy as an attribute to God himself. However, Cardinal Walter Cosper, one of the most prominent theologians in the last several decades in the Catholic Church, who wrote this book on mercy, which actually influenced Pope Francis very much, Cosper says that mercy is not just an attribute of God. It needs to be understood more fundamentally. It is God's defining attribute, he says. It cannot be regarded as marginal or derivative. Instead, he says, mercy is the essence of God, who is love. Pope Francis, in one of his writings, says it beautifully, as always. God's name is mercy. So mercy is at the very heart of God. The English word mercy doesn't maybe capture what the word means. The Latin or the Spanish or the Italian misericordia really captures it, because at the center of that word is the word cor, which means heart. And the German captures it pretty well too. And it talks about mercy as Barmherzigkeit. And again, right in the middle of the word is that word Herz. So mercy is at the very heart of God. And as Shakespeare says, it's not strained. Oh, I guess I'll give mercy. No, it just comes out. It just pours out of the heart of God. And this is why, as Pope Francis says over and over again, God never tires of forgiving us. We might get tired of asking for forgiveness, he says, but God never tires of forgiving us. But I think because mercy is at the very heart of God and comes from God's overflowing heart, mercy has a stronger meaning than just being forgiving. I think it really says three things. I think it says that God delights in creating, pouring forth being from God's very being. And God sees the pain of our world and wants to do something about it. And also, as human beings sin, God is always forgiving. I think mercy, through creation, through works of healing and justice, and through works of forgiving, is really the deepest motive for God's mission, for the mission of God. Now let's look at a few places in the Bible, both Old Testament and New Testament, where we can see this. Let's look first of all at mercy from the beginning and mercy in Israel. In a biography that I read of Pope Francis a number of months ago, the biographer tells the story of Pope Francis during an Angelus message in Rome. The Pope comes out on the balcony every Sunday at noon and gives a message around this kind of traditional prayer, this traditional Catholic prayer called the Angelus, recalling the Incarnation. And the Pope always says the Angelus, and then he gives a little fervorino. So very soon after he was elected, Pope Francis told of an old woman that he met when he was Archbishop in Buenos Aires. And that woman came up to him and said, "You know, Your Eminence, without mercy, the world would not exist." And Francis says, "You know what I told her?" I said, "Are you a theologian? Do you teach theology at the Gregorian University in Rome?" So profound was that idea. Creation is God's first act of mercy. And creation is God's first act of mission, because I think it's that expression of God's overflowing heart of mercy. St. Bonaventure in the Middle Ages talked about how God is diffusive of God's self. That God can't stay by God's self. God is diffusive of God's self. A wonderful colleague of mine at Catholic Theological Union, Anthony Gittins, once said, God is love hitting the cosmic fan. I love that definition of God. So that it's God's being to share being. That's the deepest aspect, perhaps, of God's mercy. It reminds me of a wonderful poem by the poet Jessica Powers. She writes, "I am copying down in a book from my heart's archives the day that I ceased to fear God with a shadowy fear. It was the day I began to see truly that I came forth from nothing and ever towards nothingness tend. That the works of my hands are a foolishness wrought in the presence of the worthiest king in a kingdom that shall never end. I rose up from the acres of self that I tended with passion and defended with flurries of pride. I walked out of myself and went into the woods of God's mercy. And here I abide." The Australian theologian Dennis Edwards, in his writings about cosmology and creation, describes the act of creation as the gentle, caring, loving action of the Holy Spirit. The Spirit who doesn't manipulate, but coaxes and persuades the universe into being. The formation of the gases and the molecules and the stars and the planets, and as things get more and more complex, of microbes and pine trees and deer and badgers and bluebirds and human beings. Elizabeth Johnson, the great Catholic theologian, talks about how the Spirit is present through all the creation process, but she says never as a presence of a determining monarch, but as the freeing, life-giving presence of a lover. Another Catholic theologian, Elia Delio, writes, talks about God. God is, and we could say the Spirit here as well, the beggar of love, who waits at every creature's door without daring to force it open. So creation is conceived in and executed in mercy. Mercy, as Shakespeare says, is the mightiest in the mighty. Which leads me to quote again that wonderful line from Thomas Aquinas that I quoted this morning, and that Pope Francis quotes, that mercy manifests God's omnipotence to the greatest degree. Mercy, gentleness, tenderness shows how God is really fully in charge, fully omnipotent. It's in the history, though, of a relatively insignificant people that God revealed God's self fully as a God of mercy. In Abraham, all nations would find a blessing. And in and through Israel, God would show mercy to the entire world. And at the beginning of Exodus, I love this. I was reading this a couple of months ago, actually during Lent, and I was so struck by this. God appears in the burning bush to Moses and says, I have seen the suffering of my people. I have heard their cries, and I have come down to deliver them. This is the mercy of the God of Israel. And as God gives the law to Moses on Mount Sinai, that great proof for Israel of God's mercy and love, he passes by Moses and cries out, the Lord, a God merciful and gracious, slow to anger and abounding in steadfast love and faithfulness, keeping steadfast love for the 1,000th generation. I could go through a lot of passages in the Bible, but I want to focus just a moment on the 11th chapter of the prophet Hosea. There's a wonderful Anglican theologian by the name of Sam Wells who writes about this in a sermon that I read that I think is really powerful. He says, Hosea 11 says everything about God's love and about God's mercy. He talks about it in 4 parts. I just want to reduce it here to 3 parts. The first part is where God is reminiscing about God's love for Israel. Very famous passages. When Israel was a child, I loved him. It was I who taught Ephraim how to walk. I was to them like those who lift infants to their cheeks. And Wells says, you can feel God stroking Israel's soft skin. What a tender image. But then the scene changes. And God laments Israel's unfaithfulness. The more I called them, the more they went from me. My people are bent on turning away from me. And then in a third scene, which Wells says, perhaps the most poignant of all, we're given a window into the heart of God. And as Wells describes it, it's almost like it's an all-night struggle between sober, realistic pragmatism, let them go, passionate, wild fury, and then ultimately tender compassion or mercy. And so we hear God saying, how can I give you up, Ephraim? How can I hand you over, Israel? My heart recoils within me. My compassion, my mercy grows warm and tender. God can't save Israel from the consequences of its unfaithfulness. Israel goes into exile. Israel suffers for the infidelity that Israel, both kingdoms, have done. But God keeps working and promises that new covenant and works until that new covenant is ultimately fulfilled. Pope Francis quotes St. Augustine in one of his writings where Augustine says, it's easier for God to hold back anger than it is to hold back mercy. Again, that outflowing heart of God. There's one small verse in Psalm 49, which I love very much, which might explain, as Wells says, that God's love is crazy, illogical, and a matter of pure grace. And it's the line, God delights in God's people. There's simply something about this people that moved God's heart. And as the Old Testament goes on, we see that this applies to all peoples. One of my favorite novels of all time is a novel written by Marilynne Robinson called Gilead. It's about a Congregationalist minister in a small town in Iowa called Gilead. And of course, John Ames, that's the man's name, his best friend is a Presbyterian minister across town, and they are constantly in conversation. So Ames has read Calvin. And in one of his musings in this novel, he writes this. He says, somewhere in Calvin writes that each person is an actor on a stage and God is the audience. And he goes on to say, I do like Calvin's image. It suggests how God might actually enjoy us. I believe we think of that far too little. But then he goes on to say, not in any simple sense, of course, but as you enjoy the being of a child, even though he's a thorn in your heart. I love that passage, and I think that expresses so much also about God's mercy. God not just loves us, God delights in us. And this is why God created us. And we come, as we open the New Testament, to incarnate mercy. In the fullness of time, as Paul wrote, the mercy lavished upon all creation, but Israel specifically, takes on a human face in the person of Jesus of Nazareth. He is incarnate mercy. He is, as Pope Francis writes, the face of mercy. Or another Anglican theologian, I love this, Mark Oakley, says, Jesus is God's body language. Jesus expresses in the flesh what God is all about. And we see God's mercy in Jesus' exorcisms and healings. We see it in Jesus' healing of blind Bartimaeus, for example, who cries out, Jesus, Son of David, have mercy on me. And Jesus did. And Bartimaeus received his sight. Or we see mercy in Jesus' healing of a leper. In Mark's version, Jesus hears the leper's plea and was moved to pity, was moved to mercy, and reached out and touched the leper. A couple of months ago, I was reflecting on this passage, and I was thinking, what did that look like? If it were me, it probably would have been, touch like that and get away from this ugly, sore-filled person. Can you imagine Jesus, though? Not a hesitant and fearful touch, but a loving, generous, and merciful touch, a real embrace. And the leper, because of Jesus' mercy, because of God's mercy incarnate in Jesus, was healed. Every once in a while, too, we see mercy incarnate in Jesus' attitudes and actions. I was reflecting a while ago on Mark 6. Mark 6 is where the disciples come back. They've been sent out to Jesus to drive out demons and all that stuff. And they come back and they're all excited. And Jesus is in the midst of this crowd. And it says they're so busy that they didn't even have time to eat. But Jesus sees the disciples and they're all excited. He says, it's almost like he says, let's go away for a while. Let's find a quiet place. It's almost like, let's process this. Let's have some theological reflection about this. So he tries to leave the crowd, and he takes the disciples, and they go around to the other side of the lake where there's a deserted spot. The people figure out what's going on. They jump in boats. They cut across the lake. So it's almost like Jesus and the disciples round the bend, and there they all are. There they all are again. And, again, my reaction would have been, oh, no. I'm trying to get away. I'm trying to get some peace. But Jesus's was not. Oh, no. The text says he just began to heal. He just began to teach. And eventually he fed the crowds. This is incarnate mercy. This is, I think, the face of mercy. This is God's body language. And many of Jesus' parables are incarnations in words of God's mercy, especially those 3 parables in Luke 15. I remember reading one time, if we ever lost all the Gospels and we only had this chapter of Luke, we'd have it all. We'd have everything that is there. But the parable of the shepherd who goes after the lost sheep, or the woman who tears her house apart to find the lost coin, or especially the story of, however you want to say it, the prodigal son, the loving father, the recalcitrant brother, whatever. But it's a story. These are all stories about God's amazing mercy. In these parables, I think we see the determination of God in the parables of the shepherd and the woman, and God's patience in the parable of the loving father, and then God's joy when that determination succeeds and that patience pays off. So that truth of Pope Francis, again, God never tires in forgiving us. About a year ago or so, I ran across a really wonderful poem by Wendell Berry, a great Appalachian poet. And it's called To My Mother. And it reads like this. I was your rebellious son. Do you remember? I wonder if you do remember. So complete has your forgiveness been. So complete has your forgiveness been, I wonder sometimes if it did not precede my wrong, and I erred, safe found within your love, prepared ahead of me, who perhaps foresaw the worst that I might do, and forgave before I could act, causing me to smile now, looking back, to see how paltry was my worst compared to your forgiveness of it already given. A beautiful parallel, I think, to that parable of the prodigal son or the loving father. But God's mercy was perhaps most fully and graphically revealed in Jesus' death on the cross. As Paul says so powerfully, it's hard enough to die for a good person, and yet Jesus reveals the merciful heart of God, that while we were yet sinners, Christ died for us. Denise Levertov, great American poet, has a poem called To Live in the Mercy of God, which I think captures the passion in every sense of the word of the crucifixion. She writes, to live in the mercy of God, to feel vibrate the enraptured waterfall, flinging itself unabating down and down to clenched fists of rock. Swiftness of plunge, hour after year after century. Thus, not mild, not temperate, God's love for the world. Vast flood of mercy flung on resistance. I think that captures so beautifully the pouring out of God's love on the cross. We all know, though, that Jesus' death was not the end of the story, as if it were, as the New Testament scholar N.T. Wright argues, we wouldn't be able to explain how Jesus and his story continue to live on in history. As it is, the mercy of God incarnate in Jesus through the resurrection and through Jesus' resurrected life has been shared with Jesus' disciples, those of us called to be the church. And so we come to the second part of my presentation, a people of mercy, a community of missionary, mercy-bearing disciples. The great mercy of God doesn't stop with God simply having mercy on us, giving us the existence of life, working for our healing and liberation, or restoring us to relationship after sin. God's mercy takes us into God's very life, which means it takes us into God's very mission. We see this as we read Paul. This is something that's striking me more and more in these days. In virtue of baptism, as Paul writes so often, Christians, as it were, put on Christ. They have the mind of Christ. They're conformed to Christ. They are Christ's body in the world. We have become God's body language through our baptism. And so what I'd like to suggest is that because God is a God of mercy, and God shares that life so fully with us, we are people of mercy, and we are called to be people of mercy. God is that intemperate waterfall, that mercy which is not strained. Pope Francis writes in one of his writings, God is a river of mercy, or the deep woods of God's mercy in which Jessica Powers dwelt. And we who are baptized share the divine life. We're called to be witnesses to sacraments of God's mercy, to embody God's mercy in our world. The church, as John Sobrino says, needs to be de-centered by God's mercy. And how might we embody mercy today? To be a church of mercy. And I think, first of all, that means to realize that we as a church need mercy. I think one of the first things that we can do to show God's mercy to the world is to recognize that we are people who need God's mercy. We are not just the agents of God's mercy. We are also the objects of God's mercy as well. But as Pope Francis writes again, the church needs to be in the world an oasis of mercy. As he writes, we need to come across to the world as a mother with an open heart, as the house of the Father with doors always wide open, as the house of the father of the prodigal son. And part of this open door policy, Pope Francis says, and this is particularly true of my Catholic Church, I think, that the doors of the sacraments should not be closed for any reason. It's wonderful how Pope Francis, early in his pontificate, baptized the child of a couple that had not yet been married in the church. He talks about how the Eucharist should not be a reward for the perfect, but a powerful medicine for the weak. And so in our church, the big discussion that has been going on about allowing divorced and remarried people to receive communion. This is a big step for us. And in Pope Francis's latest encyclical, Amoris Laetitia, he lays down some possibilities for this to take place. It's very controversial in our church, but I think it's absolutely necessary to show that we are an oasis of mercy. Francis writes how the church is not a toll house. The confessional should not be a torture chamber. And priests should not use a club of judgment when they preach the gospel. In an interview that he gave early in his pontificate, he says the ministers of the church must be ministers of mercy above all. Pope Francis's motto is from a homily by the Venerable Bede. It's on the calling of Matthew. Having mercy, he chose him. But the Pope refers in his Spanish, he says, we have to use the words misericordiando. Mercying, he chose him. He makes mercy into a verb. And what that means for us as people of mercy, that we need to do the works of mercy. In the Catholic tradition, we have what are called the corporal and the spiritual works of mercy. The corporal works of mercy, which have their roots in the Old Testament, in Isaiah and Micah, but where the Christian form draws from the judgment scene in Matthew. I was hungry, and you gave me to eat. I was thirsty, and you gave me something to drink. A stranger, and you gave me clothing. Naked, and you gave me clothing. Stranger, you welcomed me, sick, and you visited me. And in prison, and you also visited me. And to these 6 practices, the Catholic Church has added the practice of burying the dead. And I think Pope Francis has also said we should add another one, and that is the care for creation. And then the spiritual works of mercy are to instruct the ignorant, to counsel the doubtful, comfort the sorrowful, admonish the sinner, gladly forgive injuries, bear wrongs patiently, and pray for the living and the dead. Hand in hand with these acts of mercy is the commitment to justice. Mercying doesn't just relieve suffering and misery, it goes to the roots of the problems that cause just suffering and misery. And so we work for personal, social, and structural change. As John Sobrino says, not just by the works of mercy, but by the whole principle of mercy. And this is not just justice for victims, but justice also for perpetrators, where we should season our justice with mercy. Just a few reflections as we come to an end here to talk about how do we mercy in today's world and in today's USA. Now, there are many concrete ways. I'm just going to focus on 3. First of all, mercy to refugees and migrants and asylum seekers. Mercy to the world's victims. And thirdly, mercy to creation. Looking at mercy for migrants and refugees, Pope Francis's first trip outside the Vatican was to the island of Lampedusa in the Mediterranean Sea, where so many Africans were coming, having tried to cross the Mediterranean Sea. And he said in his homily there that many victims were dying at sea in boats which were vehicles of hope that had become vehicles of death. And then he says, has any of us wept because of this situation? For the fathers and the mothers and so forth and so on. And he says that the globalization of indifference has taken from us the ability to weep, to have mercy on these people. We see the same kind of indifference in many Europeans with Syrian migrants or with demagogues who would exclude Muslims from our country or build a wall across our borders. Bishop Long Nguyen, who is a Vietnamese Australian bishop and who leads the Australian Bishops' Committee on Migrants and Refugees, says this: we Australians have rightly felt appalled at the danger that refugees experience on their journeys. But we seem to have come to believe that harshness and rejection, stop the boats is the motto in Australia, will be enough to deter desperate people from their flight to safety. So as individual Christians and as church, we need to do all we can to show mercy to these poorest of the poor. Corporal works of mercy, of welcoming the stranger, the spiritual work of mercy, of praying for the living and the dead, the way we vote, the way we give our various financial contributions, our prayer. Our U.S. bishops, the Catholic bishops, talk about what we can do. Pray, write to the president, write to members of Congress, contact Catholic charities, and donate. Then there's mercy for victims and perpetrators. Consoling the sorrowful, I think, takes a real concreteness here as we open our hearts to the world's victims, whether it's women sexually harassed and raped, or victims displaced by war or human trafficking, or child soldiers, victims of sexual abuse, victims of racism, victims of police brutality. And then the corporal work of mercy of visiting the sick, for victims of AIDS and Ebola and Zika, of giving food to the hungry and drink to the thirsty, with aiding victims of natural disasters. Of course, much harder is to give mercy to perpetrators. But we can practice the corporal works of mercy by visiting prisoners, or the spiritual works of mercy by trying to forgive injuries and bearing wrongs. It doesn't mean, of course, that we have to forget the evil done or absolving them of the consequences of their actions, because society needs to be protected from criminals and rapists and so forth. But still, no inhuman punishment, no torture. We need to work for restorative justice, and I could talk an awful lot about that. I heard a talk by a Ugandan priest a couple of months ago who talked about the importance of forgiving perpetrators. And he said, it almost sounds impossible, but we Christians live in another order, and we have to really work at that to be people of mercy. Finally, mercy for creation. Francis, in his document Evangelii Gaudium, speaks about creation as one of the poor of the world, as a defenseless being. And in his encyclical on ecology, Laudato Si', he has this chilling line: the earth is becoming a huge pile of filth. Pope John Paul II called us to ecological conversion. Philippine bishops wrote a long time ago, God intended this land for us, God's special creatures, but not so that we might destroy it and turn it into a wasteland. The U.S. bishops have recently put out an amazing resource for caring for God's creation. This is the Catholic bishops. Resources for liturgy, preaching, and taking action, it's called. And they say, among other things, we should take the pledge of St. Francis, which is to pray, to learn, to assess, to act, and to advocate. I was just checking the website of the Presbyterian Church USA the other day, and since 1990, Presbyterian General Assemblies have made no less than 6 statements on ecology and the environment. And so our churches are calling us to be people of mercy in this regard. Just a short word of conclusion. In Pope Francis's prayer for the year of mercy, he asks us to pray to the Lord Jesus to send the Spirit to consecrate evermore every one of us with its anointing, so that the Jubilee of Mercy may be a year of grace from the Lord, and your church, with renewed enthusiasm, may bring good news to the poor, proclaim liberty to captives and the oppressed, and restore sight to the blind. I think, in other words, Pope Francis asks us to pray that the God of mercy make us a people of mercy, partners in God's mission of mercy. Thank you.